So, I'm standing in the middle of this stunning Brooklyn brownstone, the kind of place with original crown molding and windows so big they make the whole world look expensive. It's my 21st birthday, and my dad is hovering over me with this weird, twitchy energy. He hands me a glass of champagne, but before I can even take a sip, he's sliding a manila folder onto the mahogany table. "Just a formality, Maya," he says, giving me that practiced, trust me smile he used to use on his clients before his firm tanked. "Since you're an adult now, we just need to consolidate the family holdings." Uncle Paul's already got the paperwork ready. I look over at my Uncle Paul, who's lean, wearing a suit that costs more than my car and currently leaning against the fireplace like he already owns the bricks. He's a high-end real estate developer, and he doesn't do anything for family unless there's a seven-figure commission involved. My mom is standing by the door, nursing a drink, her eyes starting between me and the folder like she's waiting for a bomb to go off. They think I'm the same naive girl who used to let them borrow my graduation money. They think they've got me cornered because we're at a party and I wouldn't want to make a scene. I took the pen my dad was holding out, looked him dead in the eye, and dropped it right into his champagne. The splash was the only sound in the room. "I'm not signing anything, Dad," I said, my voice way steadier than I felt. "And you might want to tell Paul to cancel the listing he put up this morning, because as of midnight, this house is held in an irrevocable trust that doesn't have your name anywhere on it." The color drained from my dad's face so fast he looked like a statue. But before he could even find his voice to start screaming, my phone buzzed in my pocket with a text from my lawyer. That's when I knew the real war was just beginning. Before we get into the screaming matches and the legal firestorm that followed that night, let's rewind. You need to understand why this house matters. My grandfather, Arthur, bought this brownstone in the late 60s for next to nothing. He was a stone mason, and he literally rebuilt this place with his own two hands. To him, this wasn't just real estate, it was a fortress. I spent every summer here growing up. While my parents were busy chasing the next big thing and blowing through their savings on memberships at clubs they couldn't afford, I was here with Grandpa Arthur. He taught me how to find the studs in the walls, how to fix a leaky faucet without calling a plumber, and how to listen to the house when the wind kicked up. He'd sit me down at the massive oak desk in his library and tell me stories about how he survived the recession by being shrewder than the bank. I didn't realize it at the time, but he was training me. He saw how my dad, his own son, looked at money. He saw the greed hidden behind the entrepreneurial spirit. One night, when I was 16, he pulled a small iron key out of his pocket and handed it to me. "Maya," he said, his voice low and serious, "people are going to tell you that family is about blood. But sometimes, blood just makes people feel entitled to things they didn't build. This house is your ground. Don't ever let anyone talk you into giving up your ground." I thought he was just being a dramatic old man. I didn't know that 2 years later, he'd be gone, and my parents would be looking at this house like it was a winning lottery ticket they just needed to find a way to cash in. And honestly, I didn't know that the key he gave me didn't just open a jewelry box, it opened a door that my parents didn't even know existed. But what I found in the secret drawer he was standing in a week after the funeral made my heart stop. So, about that desk. A week after Grandpa Arthur passed, my parents moved into the brownstone like they were conquering a small country. They started talking about modernizing the place, which was code for ripping out the hand-carved wood and replacing it with cheap, trendy marble. I was mourning the only person who actually saw me, and they were picking out paint colors for a flip. One night, I was looking for a stapler in my dad's office, formerly Grandpa's library, and I found a hidden drawer. Inside wasn't just some old paperwork. It was a stack of past due notices from a private lending firm. We're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars. My dad's building supply business wasn't just struggling like he told me, it was a sinking ship, and he was trying to use the brownstone as a life raft. But the real kicker? There was a signed agreement with a developer, Uncle Paul's company, dated 2 days before Grandpa even died. They were already planning the sale while he was still breathing. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. They hadn't even waited for the body to be cold before they were measuring the square footage for condos. I sat there in the dark holding those papers, and I realized that my parents didn't see a home, they saw a paycheck. And my Uncle Paul? He wasn't just a realtor. He was the shark circling the wreck. I almost walked out right then and confronted them, but then I remembered what Grandpa said. Patience isn't weakness. It's timing. I put the papers back exactly how I found them and realized I needed professional help. I remembered the name on a business card Grandpa once tucked into that iron key box, Elias Thorne, estate attorney. I called him the next morning from a burner phone, and let me tell you, the look on his face when I walked into his office was the first bit of hope I'd had in weeks. But what he told me next, it made the hair on my arm stand up. Elias Thorne looked like he was carved out of old mahogany himself, sharp, formal, and totally unimpressed by my parents' reputation. He sat me down and pulled a thick file from his cabinet. "Maya," he said, "your grandfather knew exactly what his son was capable of. He knew the debt, the gambling, and the bad business deals." He slid a document across the desk that looked like a standard deed, but it had a bright red seal on it. It turns out, Grandpa Arthur didn't just leave me the house in a regular will. He created what's called a conditional life estate, wrapped inside an irrevocable trust. Basically, my parents were allowed to live there, but they had zero authority to sell, mortgage, or even lease a single square inch without my express, notarized consent. And here was the trap. If they even attempted to record a sale without me, the entire property would immediately transfer to a charitable foundation, leaving them with absolutely nothing. He'd basically built a legal landmine and handed me the remote control. Elias told me that the paperwork Uncle Paul was trying to get me to sign wasn't just a formality, it was a waiver of my life estate rights. If I signed it, I was effectively giving my parents permission to kick me out and sell the place to Paul's developers for a fraction of its worth. My jaw hit the floor. My own father was trying to trick me into making myself homeless so he could pay off some loan sharks. Elias told me to stay quiet. "Let them think you're clueless," he whispered. "Let them spend the money they don't have yet. The more they commit to the sale, the harder they'll fall." So I went home and played the part of the grieving daughter. I watched them bring in contractors. I watched them toast to their future millions. But then, 3 days before my birthday, I saw something in the driveway that told me they were moving faster than I expected. The moving truck was just the tip of the iceberg. I came home from class and found my mom in my bedroom, literally throwing my clothes into boxes. She didn't even look guilty. She just looked frantic. "Maya, honey, we have to move fast," she said, not even looking at me. "The market is shifting and Paul found a buyer who wants to close in 48 hours. We've already found a cute little apartment for you near campus." A cute little apartment. That was their way of saying a basement studio with a hot plate. I stood there, watching her pack up my life, and for a second, I almost broke. I wanted to scream that this house was mine, that Grandpa had protected me, that they were being monsters. But Elias's voice was in my head, patience. I just nodded, played the part of the overwhelmed kid, and asked, "But what about the deed? Don't I need to sign something?" My mom froze for a split second, then gave me this sickeningly sweet smile. "Oh, just some minor stuff at your birthday dinner on Saturday. It's mostly just your dad handling the legacy." Legacy. They were using that word like a weapon. I spent that night at the brownstone, but I didn't sleep. I crept down to the kitchen and heard my dad on the phone with Paul. Paul was panicking. Apparently, he'd already taken a $100,000 reservation fee from a developer to clear the lot, and if the title wasn't clean by Monday, they were going to sue him into the ground. That was the missing piece of the puzzle. They weren't just greedy, they were desperate. They had gambled with money they didn't have on a house they didn't own, and they were counting on me to be too stupid to notice. I realized then that they weren't just selling the house, they were selling me out to save their own skins. I texted Elias, "They're closing on Monday. We move Saturday." He replied with one word, "Locked," but I couldn't even imagine that on my birthday my own uncle would bring a fake notary to the party. The day of my 21st birthday was surreal. The house was filled with flowers, catering trays, and people I barely knew, mostly business associates of Paul's and old friends of my parents who only showed up when there was free booze. Everyone was acting like it was this grand celebration of me coming of age, but the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Every time I looked at my dad, he was checking his watch. Every time I looked at Paul, he was whispering in the corner with a guy in a gray suit who looked way too serious for a birthday party. That guy, I realized, was the notary. He was there to make sure that the moment I put pen to paper, the deal was legally bulletproof. Around 8 p.m., my dad gathered everyone in the library. He made this long, emotional speech about Grandpa Arthur and passing the torch to the next generation. It was a masterpiece of gaslighting. People were actually tearing up. Then he pulled out the folder. "And now, Maya," he said, his voice booming for the audience, "if you'll just sign these transition documents, we can ensure that this house stays part of the Tmaine legacy forever." He was lying through his teeth in front of 50 people. Paul stepped forward, holding a high-end fountain pen. "It's a big moment, kiddo," he said, his eyes cold as ice. I looked around the room. I saw the greed in my parents' eyes. I saw the desperation in Paul's. And then I looked at the notary, who was already uncapping his stamp. I took the pen. I leaned over the table. I could see the header of the document, irrevocable waiver of life estate interests. If I signed this, it was over. I could feel my dad's hand on my shoulder, squeezing just a little too hard. I felt the weight of every summer I'd spent fixing those walls. I looked at the signature line, and then I looked at my dad. "You know, Dad," I said, loud enough for the whole room to hear, "Grandpa Arthur told me you'd do exactly this." The room went dead quiet. My dad's hand tightened on my shoulder. "Maya, don't be silly," he chuckled, but it sounded like he was choking on a marble. "Just sign the paper so we can get to the cake." I looked at Uncle Paul. "How much is the deposit, Paul?" 100,000? 200. Paul's face went from tan to pasty white in a second. He tried to step toward me, but I stepped back, holding the document up for everyone to see. "This isn't a transition document," I said, my voice ringing out through the library. "This is a waiver. My father and my uncle are trying to trick me into giving up my inheritance so they can sell this house to developers on Monday. They've already spent the money, and they've already tried to pack my bags." The guests started murmuring, looking at each other. My mom stepped forward, her face twisted in rage. "Maya, stop this embarrassing scene right now. We are doing this for the family." I laughed, and it was the best feeling in the world. "No, Mom, you're doing this for your credit card bills. But here's the thing you didn't check." I pulled a small, folded piece of paper out of my pocket, the one Elias had prepared. "Grandpa didn't just leave me the house. He put it in a trust that triggered the second you tried to sell it without my knowledge. As of midnight, I am the sole trustee. And according to the bad faith clause in the trust, any attempt to defraud the beneficiary, that's me, results in the immediate eviction of any tenants. That means you, Dad. And you, Mom." My dad lunged for the paper in my hand, but I was faster. I dropped his expensive fountain pen into his champagne glass and walked toward the door. "Paul, I hope that developer has a good legal team," I said over my shoulder, "because you're going to need every penny of that deposit to pay for the lawsuits coming your way." I walked out of that library and didn't look back, but the real victory came the next morning when I returned to the house with bailiffs and lock. The next morning was the quietest the brownstone had been in years. I had stayed at a hotel, and at exactly 8 a.m., I showed up at the front door with Elias Thorne and a team of locksmiths. My parents were still inside, probably hungover and definitely panicked. When they saw me through the window, my dad tried to lock the door, but it was too late. Elias stepped forward with the court order. "Mr. Tmaine," Elias said, his voice like a gavel hitting a desk, "the trust has been activated. You have 4 hours to remove your personal belongings. The house is now under the exclusive control of the trustee." I watched them crumble. It wasn't like a movie where there's a big explosion. It was just pathetic. My mom started crying, saying I was destroying the family. My dad tried to negotiate, offering me a percentage of the future sale. That was never going to happen. I just stood there in the hallway, the same hallway where I'd learned to walk, and realized I didn't feel guilty. I felt free. By noon, they were gone. Uncle Paul was a different story. He tried to sue me for tortious interference with his contract, but Elias just laughed him out of the room. Since Paul had signed a contract for a property he didn't own, he was on the hook for the entire penalty. Last I heard, he had to sell his own house just to stay out of jail for fraud. As for my parents, they're living in a small rental 2 towns over. I pay the rent, it's the one nice thing I do, but they aren't allowed past the front gate of the brownstone. I kept my promise to Grandpa. I kept my ground. And every morning when I wake up and see the sun hitting those original wood floors, I know I made the right choice. Family isn't about who you're born to, it's about who shows up and who keeps the promises. That's my story. If you've ever had to stand your ground against people who were supposed to love you, tell me in the comments. I read everything. And don't forget to subscribe. The first night alone in the brownstone was loud. Not because of noise, but because of the silence. Every creak of the floorboards felt like the house was finally exhaling after holding its breath for years. I spent the night in Grandpa Arthur's library, sitting on the floor because I'd had the movers take out my parents' cheap, modern furniture along with their stuff. I was scrolling through my phone, blocking my mom's 10th "how could you text" when I noticed something off about the built-in bookshelves. One of the bottom panels didn't line up with the molding. I remembered Grandpa always saying, if you want to hide a secret, put it where people are too lazy to bend down. I grabbed a flathead screwdriver from his old toolkit and pried the wood back. Behind it wasn't a wall, it was a small, fireproof floor safe. My heart started hammering against my ribs. I tried the combination of my birthday, then his nothing. Then I tried the date he finished building the house, 1968. Click. The heavy door swung open, and inside wasn't gold or jewelry. It was a single, thick black ledger and a thumb drive. I opened the ledger to the first page and felt the blood drain from my face. It was a meticulous record of every loan Grandpa had given my father over the last 15 years. But these weren't just business investments. There were dates, amounts, and notes in Grandpa's handwriting like bailing him out of the Atlantic City mess and paying off the firm's silent partners so he doesn't go to jail. My dad hadn't just been struggling. He'd been a professional disaster for over a decade, and Grandpa had been his secret safety net. But the last entry, dated just a month before he died, was the one that made me feel sick. It said, "He's talking to Sterling. If he does this, he's no son of mine." I didn't know who Sterling was yet, but I was about to find out, because just then, the heavy brass knocker on the front door echoed through the empty house like a gunshot. I looked at the clock. It was nearly midnight. Nobody knocks like that at midnight unless they're coming for something they think you owe them. I grabbed the ledger, shoved it into the safe, and headed to the front door. I checked the security camera on my phone. Standing on the stoop was a guy in a tailored black overcoat, looking like he'd stepped straight out of a high-stakes thriller. He wasn't yelling, he was just waiting. I opened the heavy oak door just a crack, keeping the security chain on. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice as cold as the wind outside. The man didn't flinch. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card that just said Sterling Global Holdings. "My name is Marcus Sterling," he said, his voice smooth and terrifyingly calm. "I believe your father, Greg, owes me a very specific conversation regarding a property transfer that was supposed to happen yesterday." I felt a chill go down my spine that had nothing to do with the weather. This was the guy Grandpa mentioned in the ledger. "My father doesn't live here anymore," I said, trying to keep my hand from shaking. "And this property isn't for sale. Ever." Sterling tilted his head, giving me this pitying look that made me want to scream. "Maya, right? You've got a lot of your grandfather's fire. But you see, your father didn't just promise me the house. He took a $3 million private equity infusion to keep his company from being liquidated. And he used this address as the primary collateral." I laughed, but it sounded brittle. "He couldn't have. He didn't own the house." "You're a smart guy, Marcus. You didn't check the title." Sterling's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, we checked it. And we found a very interesting loophole regarding the 2012 tax assessment that your father used to claim sole ownership. If I were you, I'd stop looking at the deed and start looking at the fine print of the municipal records. I'll be back on Monday with the marshals." I slammed the door and ran back to the library, my mind racing a mile a minute. A 2012 tax assessment? That was the year Grandpa had that minor stroke, and I spent the whole summer reading to him. My dad had handled all the boring paperwork that year. I grabbed the thumb drive from the safe and plugged it into my laptop. It was encrypted, but the hint was the first stone. I thought back to the basement, to the cornerstone Grandpa had let me help him set when I was 10. I typed in the date, 07142010. The files popped up, and I felt like I was looking at a crime scene. It wasn't just tax records. My dad had forged Grandpa's signature on a power of attorney document while he was in the hospital, and then used that to reclassify the brownstone as a commercial asset under his company's name. It was a long con. He'd been planning this for years, waiting for the right moment to flip the house and vanish with the cash. He hadn't just been a bad businessman, he was a predator. And now, this Sterling guy was coming to collect on a debt that was built on a lie. If the city records showed the house belonged to the company, my trust might not be enough to stop a high court seizure. I needed to move fast. I called Elias, but it went straight to voicemail. Then I realized I couldn't just play defense anymore. If Sterling wanted to play dirty, I had to go to the source. I didn't have much, but I had the ledger. I spent the rest of the night scanning every page, realizing that my dad's debt wasn't just to Sterling. He'd been double-dipping, taking money from 3 different firms for the same collateral. He was running a Ponzi scheme with my home as the bait. I felt a weird mix of rage and total clarity. My parents were losers, yeah, but they were also dangerous. I needed to find where they were hiding, because they were the only ones who could give me the original forged documents I needed to blow this whole thing wide open. I left my parents in that motel room without another word. I had 48 hours before Sterling showed up at my door, and now I knew his real target, the tunnels. Grandpa Arthur had been a master mason who spent years working on the city's infrastructure. My dad hadn't just tried to sell a house. He had offered a criminal waypoint into the city's underground. I drove straight to Uncle Paul's Midtown office. I knew I couldn't walk through the front door, so I waited for the 2 a.m. security smoke break. I slipped through the side entrance, moving silently like Grandpa once taught me. I reached the executive floor, the silence of the office feeling heavy and judgmental. Paul's office was at the end of the hall. I used a thin strip of plastic to trip the magnetic lock. Click. I was in. The safe was behind a cliché painting of a yacht. I tried the address of the brownstone. The safe popped open. There it was, the blue folder. I grabbed the original forged documents, but as I turned to leave, the lights flooded the room. Uncle Paul was standing in the doorway, pale and trembling, holding his phone. "You shouldn't have come here, Maya," he whispered. "Sterling doesn't like loose ends." Paul looked like a man who hadn't slept in a week. "Give me the folder, Maya. I can still fix this. I can talk to him." I tucked the folder under my arm and stood my ground. "Talk to who, Paul? The people who want to turn Grandpa's house into a drug tunnel? You're a developer, not a kingpin. How did you get this deep?" Paul stepped closer, his eyes darting to the hallway. It was supposed to be a simple flip. But Greg's debt just kept growing. Sterling offered to wipe it all out if we gave him the infrastructure. I didn't have a choice. I felt pure disgust. You always have a choice. You just chose the one that made you rich. Suddenly, my phone buzzed. An unknown number texted, "Look out the window." I glanced at the street below. 3 black SUVs had just pulled up, blocking the entrance. Sterling's marshals were here, and they weren't waiting for Monday. "He's here, isn't he?" I asked. Paul nodded, looking like he was about to vomit. "He tracked your car. Maya, please, just give him what he wants. He'll let you walk away. He just wants the house." I realized then that if I gave up this folder, I was giving them the keys to a criminal empire. I turned and ran toward the back of the office. I knew these glass and steel buildings have mechanical rooms with freight elevators. I heard heavy, rhythmic footsteps echoing in the hall, professional and fast. I ducked into the mechanical room and slammed the heavy metal bolt just as someone threw their weight against the door. The impact was deafening. I looked at the freight elevator, but it was locked with a keypad. I had 10 seconds before they broke through. I pulled out my phone and did the only thing that could save me. I went live on Instagram. "My name is Maya Tmaine," I said, my voice surprisingly loud. "And if I disappear tonight, it's because Marcus Sterling and Paul Tmaine are trying to steal my home for a criminal enterprise. I have the proof. And now, so do you." I pointed the camera at the blue folder, flipping through the forged signatures and the secret maps of the subway connections. It's all here, I told the 300 people who jumped onto the stream within seconds. The signatures are fake. The debt is a scam. And Sterling Global is a front for something much darker. The viewer count climbed to 1,000. My friends were sharing it, tagging news outlets and the NYPD. The footsteps outside the door suddenly stopped. They couldn't afford to be seen on camera breaking in now. A voice came through the door, smooth and authoritative. Maya, turn off the phone. Let's talk like adults. I didn't stop. Talk? Like you talk to my grandfather? I'm calling the police, and I'm not leaving this room until they arrive. I heard a muffled curse, then the sound of retreating footsteps. They were ghosting. They knew the second this went public, the quiet deal was dead. I sat on the floor, my back against the vibrating elevator, and kept talking to the camera for 40 minutes until I heard the real sirens outside. When the NYPD finally burst into the room, I didn't feel relief. I felt a grim kind of satisfaction. I handed them the blue folder and my phone. Everything you need is right here, I told the sergeant. As they led me out, I saw Sterling's SUVs disappearing into the night. He was gone for now, but I had the proof. The city issued an emergency stay on the property. My home was safe, but the war was just beginning. The next few months were a blur of depositions and court hearings. My dad and Uncle Paul were indicted on multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy. My mom managed to avoid jail by testifying against Paul, but the bridge between us was burned to ash. Some things can't be fixed with an apology. 6 months later, I was finally moving my things back into the brownstone when a courier arrived. It was a package from a law firm in Switzerland. Inside was a letter from Grandpa Arthur, dated a week before he died. Maya, it read. If you're reading this, it means you found the ledger and you didn't let them break you. I knew you'd be the one to hold the line. At the bottom of the box, I found architectural plans I'd never seen before. It wasn't for the house, it was for a foundation. Grandpa had left a hidden account specifically to turn the brownstone into a community center for at-risk youth, a place to teach them trades. He knew all along I wouldn't want to live in a big, empty house alone. He had given me a mission. But as I started the renovations, the house had one last secret to give up. The next few months were a blur of depositions and court hearings. My dad and Uncle Paul were indicted on multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy. My mom managed to avoid jail by testifying against Paul, but the bridge between us was burned to ash. Some things can't be fixed with an apology. 6 months later, I was finally moving my things back into the brownstone when a courier arrived. It was a package from a law firm in Switzerland. Inside was a letter from Grandpa Arthur, dated a week before he died. Maya, it read. If you're reading this, it means you found the ledger and you didn't let them break you. I knew you'd be the one to hold the line. At the bottom of the box, I found architectural plans I'd never seen before. It wasn't for the house, it was for a foundation. Grandpa had left a hidden account specifically to turn the brownstone into a community center for at-risk youth, a place to teach them trades. He knew all along I wouldn't want to live in a big, empty house alone. He had given me a mission. But as I started the renovations, the house had one last secret to give up. I spent hours in that cold room, going through files that should have been burned years ago. Grandpa Arthur had originally built this hub for the city's elite to trade information, but he tried to shut it down when it turned dark. My mom, his apprentice, never let go. She had been feeding my dad's failing business with consultation fees from people like Sterling for years. While I was reading, my phone buzzed. It was the local precinct. Maya, we have your mother here. She's claiming you've illegally evicted her and stole business documents. I almost laughed. She was trying to use the law to get back into the basement before I found her secrets. Sergeant, I said, my voice like ice, I'm looking at those documents right now. Tell the district attorney that the Tmaine case just got a whole lot bigger. I called Elias. Get the car, I told him. We're going to the station. And bring the federal prosecutor's number. We're ending this tonight. I couldn't just pay her rent anymore. She was a cancer on this house, and I had to cut it out. Walking into the precinct was like entering a movie set where I held the script. My mom was sitting there looking like a distressed victim in her cashmere coat. When she saw me, she gave me a fake, trembling smile. Maya, honey, thank God. Tell these officers there's been a mistake. I didn't say a word. I just handed a heavy envelope to the sergeant. These were behind a steel plate in the basement. They detailed 20 years of illegal brokering and links to Sterling's offshore accounts. My mother's signature is on every page. The silence was heavy. My mom's face transformed from concerned parent to stone-cold predator in seconds. She didn't beg. She just looked at me with pure hatred. You think you're a hero, she hissed as officers stepped toward her. You're just like us, Maya. You just have a better lawyer. I looked at her and felt nothing. No, Mom, I said. I'm like Grandpa. I know how to build things that last. You only know how to hide in the walls. They led her away in handcuffs, and I finally felt the weight of my family's lies lift off my shoulders. The legacy was finally clean. The final court date was a circus. My dad and Uncle Paul were led in wearing orange jumpsuits. The sentencing was brutal because of the new racketeering evidence. Paul got 15 years. Even my mom got 8. As they led my dad out, he tried to whisper, I did it for you, Maya. I didn't even turn my head. You didn't do it for me. You did it because you were too lazy to be a Mason and too greedy to be a man. That was the last time I spoke to him. 6 months later, the ribbon cutting for the foundation was the most beautiful day in the history of the block. We had 50 kids enrolled in our first masonry program. The smell of fresh sawdust filled the air, replacing the scent of old lies. I stood on the stairs, watching teenagers learn to level a brick wall, the same way Grandpa taught me. I saw a plaque we'd installed by the door. It didn't have my name. It just said, Built to Last. Founded by Maya Tmaine. Protected by Maya. I was officially broke in terms of personal millions, but I'd never felt wealthier. The final court date was a circus. My dad and Uncle Paul were led in wearing orange jumpsuits. The sentencing was brutal because of the new racketeering evidence. Paul got 15 years. My father got 12. Even my mom got 8. As they led my dad out, he tried to whisper, I did it for you, Maya. I didn't even turn my head. You didn't do it for me. You did it because you were too lazy to be a Mason and too greedy to be a man. That was the last time I spoke to him. 6 months later, the ribbon cutting for the foundation was the most beautiful day in the history of the block. We had 50 kids enrolled in our first masonry program. The smell of fresh sawdust filled the air, replacing the scent of old lies. I stood on the stairs, watching teenagers learn to level a brick wall, the same way Grandpa taught me. I saw a plaque we'd installed by the door. It didn't have my name. It just said, Built to Last. Founded by Maya Tmaine. Protected by Maya. I was officially broke in terms of personal millions, but I'd never felt wealthier.